On my way out to pick a birthday gift for Diego, I unexpectedly went into early labor and gave birth to a baby boy. While waiting for him to arrive, I happened to scroll through his childhood sweetheart's social media post. Finally delivered a big, healthy boy. The dad is overjoyed. The picture showed a happy family of 3. Meanwhile, I was barely clinging to life. He hadn't even attended a single prenatal checkup with me, yet he could accompany someone else through childbirth. Without a word, I left behind the divorce papers and moved out of the city. He, however, frantically searched for me. Selena, what makes you think you can just file for divorce like this? I looked at him indifferently, my face expressionless. I'm making space for you too, you should be happy. He froze, his expression faltering, hugging me tightly. His voice trembled as he said, "Didn't you say we'd grow old together?" Chapter 1. After giving birth, I lay weakly on the hospital bed, listening to my mother nag. Diego is something else. You've just had a baby, and he's nowhere to be seen. Look at other families. What kind of pregnant woman has to go through this alone? Mom's eyebrows were practically shooting upward with anger, but I defended Diego. Mom, Diego just got promoted. The company must have a ton of things keeping him busy. For the sake of our little family, Diego often had to attend social events, always busy and on the go. He cared about me, so I had to support him in return. Mom paused mid-slice with the apple in her hand and said something that caught me off guard. Aren't you afraid he might be seeing another woman? I chuckled. Mom, I trust him. When we first started dating, Diego was always considerate of my feelings. Handsome and charismatic, he had plenty of women chasing after him. But to put me at ease, he made my picture his social media cover photo. If anyone ever gave me trouble, he was the first to step in and protect me. He once told me, as long as I'm around, no one will dare bully you. I still remember how cold the wind felt on my face that day. He held me tightly in his arms, and my heart burned with warmth. We got married right after graduating college, and we were happy. When I got pregnant, he became busier with work. I understood, but just after reassuring Mom, I saw something on my social media feed. Diego's childhood sweetheart, Julia, had posted a photo with the caption, "Finally delivered a big, healthy boy." The dad is overjoyed. In the picture, Diego was holding a baby carefully in his arms, his face radiating happiness. I set my phone down and glanced around the empty room. My son, born prematurely, was still in the incubator, fighting for his life. Tears rolled down my cheeks, large and uncontrollable, leaving Mom speechless. She hurriedly wiped my tears, panicking as she asked what was wrong. I forced a small smile and said softly, "Mom, can you do me a favor? I want a divorce." I kept looking at that photo over and over, searching for some kind of clue. A part of me absurdly hoped there was some explanation, that this was all a misunderstanding. But then I saw Diego's wedding ring lying carelessly to the side, his face brimming with joy. I remembered what he'd said during our wedding. "Selena, this ring represents the most beautiful moment of our lives. Unless my finger is severed, I will never take it off." I was so moved then, intertwining my fingers with his and holding him tightly in my arms. I knew Julia liked Diego, but Diego assured me sincerely, "Julia is like a sister to me. I have no romantic feelings for her." He swore, "If I ever like Julia, may I be struck by lightning." Worried, I quickly covered his mouth, telling him to take back the vow out of concern for him. When I got pregnant, I started experiencing relentless bouts of morning sickness day and night. He wanted to quit his job to stay at home with me, gently holding my face and saying, "I promised I wouldn't let you suffer. Please, let me take care of you." I was moved to tears, my heart swelling with warmth as I nestled into his arms. Of course, I didn't let him quit. Every day, I urged him to go to work, suppressing my discomfort as I watched him leave. When I started feeling a bit better, Julia came over. She brought a pile of gift boxes, big and small, with Diego following behind her. Standing on the balcony, I looked down and saw their intimate interaction. I reminded myself not to overthink it. After all, no one knew how good Diego was to me better than I did. They came into the house one after the other. The moment Julia saw me, she covered her mouth. "Selena, what happened to you?" I glanced down at my big belly and instinctively touched the acne scars on my face. Then, I looked at her flawless makeup and slim figure, and an unspoken sadness crept into my heart. She continued, seemingly oblivious, "Childbirth really takes such a toll on women. I swear, unless it's true love, I'll never go through this." After saying that, she covered her mouth and started dry heaving. heading straight for the bathroom. Diego quickly followed her, walking briskly and asking, "Are you feeling unwell? Do you need me to take you to the hospital?" Her eyes carried a hint of shyness, but at the time, I was still foolishly unaware of what was happening. When Julia left, she covered her face with a playful laugh and said, "Selena, you're so lucky to have a husband like Diego. You must wake up smiling in your sleep." I didn't like the way she spoke and didn't respond. After Diego walked her out, he glanced at me, said nothing, and went straight to the bedroom. I was left sitting on the couch, unsure of what to do. When Diego arrived at the hospital, it had already been 24 hours since I gave birth. My mom stayed by my side, too afraid to sleep in case I called out in pain. I hung my head, tears falling uncontrollably like a broken string of pearls. Diego hurried in with a bouquet of flowers, came close, and held my hand. "Selena, you've worked so hard. You're the hero of our family." Silently, I pulled my hand away. Suddenly, without warning, I sneezed. Immediately after, a suffocating sensation overwhelmed me. I gasped for air, my face swelling and turning red and purple from the strain. My mom jumped up and ran out of the room to call the doctor, while Diego stood there frozen, staring blankly as I struggled in agony. I held on to the last shred of consciousness, reaching out toward him, but my hand grasped nothing but air. Leaning back against the bed, I managed to utter a weak question. "Diego, I'm allergic to pollen. Did you forget?" He froze, guilt and helplessness washing over his face. I had just given birth, my body already fragile, and now I had barely survived this ordeal. Outside, Diego leaned against the wall, chain-smoking with an air of frustration, his fingers constantly scrolling through his phone. When I was moved back to a regular hospital room, it seemed he finally remembered the baby. "Selena, where's the baby? Does he look like us?" I raised my head, locking eyes with him. "Didn't you just see him? Or should I say, I saw him for you. He does look like you, just like you too." He froze for a moment, then returned to his usual demeanor. "So, you know, that baby was just an accident. Julia told me she'd never marry anyone in her life. She just wanted a child to keep her company. Since her parents passed away early, it's a request I couldn't refuse. So you slept with her, and now we both ended up pregnant at the same time?" My voice trembled as I forced the words out, my neck stiff with anger. Diego abruptly stood up, his voice raising a few notches in irritation. "What do you mean, slept with her? With modern technology, it was just artificial insemination. Why are you being so unreasonable?" Even now, he clung to the excuse of technology to deceive me. His angry voice reverberated in my chest, making it ache. I let out a bitter laugh, then spoke softly. "Diego, let's get a divorce." Diego flatly and firmly rejected me. "No, absolutely not. I won't agree. If this is about the child, I'll have Julia explain everything to you." I looked at him with a mix of emotions, struggling to understand him. If he could have a child with another woman today, he could build a life with her tomorrow. This kind of marriage was something I couldn't bear for another moment. Diego, determined to stop me from overthinking, even made an effort to spend time with me, leaving me momentarily dazed, as if we'd gone back to how things used to be. But every night, without fail, he would quietly leave, disgusted. I followed him one night and overheard his phone conversation with Julia. "How's the baby? Is he still spitting up milk? I can't leave right now. Please ask Mom to help out more." Julia's playful yet considerate voice came through the line. "It's okay. I'll take good care of myself and our baby. You should spend more time with your wife." Diego sighed in relief before replying in a softer tone. "If only she were half as understanding as you." "I can't stop worrying. I'll come see you soon." He ended the call and left without hesitation, not even glancing back. Leaning against the wall, I slowly slid down, a mournful whimper escaping my throat. When did I become a burden in his eyes? Someone unreasonable and difficult? He worried about Julia's baby spitting up milk but didn't spare a thought for our son, who was still lying in the incubator. I wrapped myself in a sweater and walked to the room where my son was. Through the glass, I could see how much he was struggling. His tiny body heaved with each breath, smaller and frilier than other babies his age. The doctor said that if he couldn't pass this critical period, he might not survive. Covering my mouth, I leaned against the glass, speaking softly to myself. "I'm sorry. This is all my fault. I made you suffer." Feeling overwhelmed, I forced myself back to the hospital room, barely holding it together. Once my postpartum confinement period ended, I wasted no time returning home to pack my things and leave. By coincidence, Julia gave birth the same day I did, and our confinement periods also ended on the same day. Naturally, Diego didn't have time for me. He called early in the morning to explain. Selena, Julia has no one to help her, and she's really overwhelmed. Her baby is still in the hospital. Mom will help you with your discharge, okay? Before he could finish, I hung up the phone with a blank expression. My mom, heartbroken, held my hand, trying to comfort me and give me strength. I shook my head, gripping her hand in return, and said firmly, Mom, you should go home. I have some things to deal with, but I'll come back afterward. She nodded, reluctant but understanding, and left. Feeling utterly disheartened, I returned home. Pushing the door open, I found Diego there as well. Julia was sitting on the sofa, nursing her baby, while Diego and my mother-in-law chatted happily, and I was just the extra piece in the room, letting out a cold laugh. I said nothing and went upstairs to my room. I pulled out my suitcase and packed only a few valuables and some clothes before heading back down. Diego looked at me in surprise, his eyes fixed on my suitcase. Where are you going? He asked, confused. Before I could answer, my mother-in-law interjected, her tone full of disdain. Why bother asking? Can't you see she's moving out? Perfect. Julia and my grandson can move in, and we can all live together happily. She shot me a scornful glare before taking the baby from Julia and doting on him. Julia walked over to me softly, and without warning, knelt down. Her sudden action startled everyone. Sister-in-law, it's all my fault. I'm getting older and just really wanted a child to keep me company. I never intended to come between you and Diego. If you feel I've done something wrong, I'll kneel and apologize to you. As she spoke, she began to lower her head, shocked. I backed away several steps. My back slammed into the cabinet, and pain shot through me, forcing me to bend over. It took a long time before I could straighten up. Diego strode forward, scooping Julia up and placing her back on the sofa. With a serious tone, he said, Julia has done nothing wrong. If anyone is to blame, it's me, Selena. We've been together for so many years. Can't you be a little more forgiving for once? Do you really want to push Julia to the brink just to feel satisfied? I held onto my aching back, slowly raised my head, and let out a bitter laugh. Forgiving? What exactly do you want me to forgive? Diego? Share a husband with another woman? I can't do that. If you insist on thinking I'm the unreasonable one, then just sign the divorce papers already. Soon you'll be able to live happily ever after with your wife and child, just like your mother always dreamed of. I threw the divorce agreement in his face and stormed out. I feared that in the next moment, my pathetic tears would start falling uncontrollably. After leaving, I arranged for my son to be transferred to a different hospital and left this painful place behind. Diego sent me messages filled with the same words over and over, insisting that divorce was out of the question. After a while, they no longer meant anything to me. Once my son was transferred, I started splitting my time between home and the hospital. Over time, I became familiar with the doctors there. By coincidence, the pediatrician, Dr. Luis, turned out to be a high school classmate of mine. We hadn't seen each other in over a decade, but he recognized me first. Are you married? He asked out of nowhere, an absurd question. I pointed to the tiny figure in the room behind the glass. That's my son. He scratched his head awkwardly and apologized several times. Luis was a pediatrician and also my son's primary doctor. Since there were many things regarding my son that required Luis's help, I decided to treat him to dinner as a gesture of gratitude. Just as we sat down at the restaurant, I spotted someone I didn't want to see. Diego and Julia were seated by the window. The baby in the stroller was kicking its tiny feet, drawing smiles and admiration from passers-by. I turned my head away and led Luis to a table in the corner, my chest burning with anger. Julia, when did you have a baby? Is this your husband? Why didn't you introduce him to us? Exactly. The little one is so adorable. Julia, you're really something. You didn't even tell us about your wedding. Be sure to let us know when you have a 1-month celebration for the baby. These must have been Julia's friends. They hadn't noticed Diego yet and were making small talk. When Diego finally appeared, the room fell into an awkward silence. One person, however, spotted me in the corner and loudly called out, Selena, you're here too. Who's this with you? I replied calmly, my son's primary doctor, Luis. Their expressions turned awkward as they collectively gasped. Julia, visibly uneasy, pushed the stroller toward us and spoke with concern. The baby, is he very sick? I never understood the hardship of being a mother before, but now I truly do. When a child gets sick, We'd willingly give our lives for them, Julia said, tears streaming down her face like they were worthless. Diego's expression grew impatient. Why are you crying for no reason? What's wrong with the child? He asked me coldly. I let out a bitter laugh and turned around. Your child is right there. What does my son have to do with you? I turned to leave, but he grabbed my arm forcefully. His teeth clenched as he spoke. He's my son too, Selena. We're not divorced yet. I mustered all my strength to pull my arm free, then slapped him hard across the face. The crowd collectively gasped, the lightness of my words landing on him like a 1,000-pound weight. Diego, all that's missing is your signature. Or do you really want to play the ancient king and have multiple wives? Chapter 2. The room fell deathly silent, and Julia leaned toward Diego with concern. Diego, does it hurt? Sister-in-law, I've already explained to you, it's not what you think between me and Diego. Why can't you just forgive him? As she spoke, she moved closer and grabbed my hand, lowering her voice so only the two of us could hear. Guess who he would choose between us? Before I could react, Julia stumbled backward, losing her balance and falling heavily to the ground. Everyone rushed to her side, her faint cries of pain tugging at their hearts. Diego gripped my shoulders tightly, his face dark with anger. Selena, you've gone too far. Luis stepped in front of me, pulling me behind him and speaking calmly. I saw everything. Selena didn't touch her. Diego raised an eyebrow and retorted. Didn't touch her? So Julia just fell on her own? Selena, why would she have any reason to frame you? I've explained this to you countless times. I only see her as a sister. Can't you stop targeting her? His tone carried frustration, yet he still treated me as if I were throwing a childish tantrum. Diego turned and walked toward Julia with practiced ease, as if he'd done this countless times before. I watched, numb, as he carefully lifted Julia onto his back, pushing the stroller in his hands as he brushed past me. Selena, don't make me lose all respect for you. Turning away, I wiped the tears from the corners of my eyes and ignored the curious stares from everyone around me. Without a word, I left the restaurant. Luis followed me, though I didn't realize it at the time. I headed straight to a bar, drinking myself into a stupor. Luis eventually found me, grabbing my shoulders to pull me up and take me home. Somehow, I managed to break free, using all the strength I had. In my drunken haze, I mistook him for Diego and shouted at him. Diego, you're so disgusting. You've already had a child with another woman. What's the point of pretending to be so devoted? My love for you was wasted, like feeding it to a dog. I walked through Hell's Gate only to finally see you clearly. Sweat and tears mingled on my forehead as I continued to cry. Luis wrapped his arms tightly around me. Then this time, choose me. I'll never let you go again. His only response was my steady breathing as I passed out in his arms. The next morning, I woke up rubbing my pounding head, trying to clear my thoughts. A series of calls on the table caught my attention. It was Luis. Selena, come to the hospital quickly. Your son, The phone slipped from my hand and hit the floor. I couldn't hear the rest of what he was saying. I rushed to the hospital as fast as I could, but I still didn't get to see my son's final moments. Luis, apologetically, said, he tried so hard. I believe he'll find his way back to you one day. I nodded, reaching out to touch his tiny face, and immediately broke down. It's all my fault. If I had stayed home that day, maybe he could have stayed in my womb a little longer. Maybe he wouldn't have been born prematurely. I hurt him. It's all my fault. Luis held my shoulders, staying silent. Later, after crying myself out, I fell into an exhausted sleep. I didn't know how much time had passed when my mother-in-law called. Is Diego with you? You're divorcing him. So why are you still clinging to him? I told Diego from the beginning to marry Julia. We know her well. But no, he was madly in love with you. Look at him now. You left, and you took my son's soul with you. By the end, her voice turned into a wailing accusation. My lips moved stiffly, and I replied hoarsely. Diego isn't here. Also, your grandson is gone. I hung up and blocked her number, finally restoring some peace to my world. I brought my son home and locked myself in my room for an entire day. When night fell, hunger finally forced me out in search of food. The refrigerator was empty, left with no other option. I went downstairs to the supermarket. Just as I returned home with my groceries, I ran into a drunken Diego. He rushed out of the darkness, burying his head in the crook of my neck. His warm breath mixed with salty tears as he said, Selena, don't leave me, please? Diego's obsession didn't feel like love anymore. It felt like a sick, twisted need for control. It wasn't about me, It was about nearly 10 years of youth he wasn't ready to give up. Perhaps he didn't want to admit he was the failure in this marriage. I calmly pushed him away and led him upstairs. He followed, confused, until I placed our son's urn in his hands. Diego, today, your son died. He looked up at me as if he hadn't heard clearly, then hesitantly touched the urn. Closing my eyes, I repeated, Diego, our child is gone. The only bond left between us turned to ashes today. Diego, devastated, bolted out of the room. I crouched down, brushing the dust off the urn, and turned to go back inside. Perhaps it's time I start living properly. Since the day Diego left, he never contacted me again. Instead, Julia would show off on social media every few days. Today, my son started crawling. He's such a sweet boy. My son can call me mommy now. My heart is melting. Her pictures not only featured the child but also a beaming mother-in-law and Diego in the background, clearly enjoying the moment. I turned off my phone and focused on finding a job that suited me, throwing myself into work. At first, I worked in a small company doing odd tasks, but as my abilities stood out, I was promoted to the headquarters, coincidentally landing in the same department as Diego. Diego's colleagues had never seen me before because he always said, "You're pregnant, and the baby is still small," to avoid any complications. Just stay at home. I agreed with his reasoning back then, not realizing the hidden meaning in his words. When Diego saw me at work, his expression was awkward and unnatural. I smiled brightly, pretending to be a stranger, greeting him as if I didn't know him, and quickly adapted to the company environment. That evening, we had a team dinner. Diego received a call and apologized for leaving early. The colleagues teased, "Everyone knows you have a new baby. Having a family and kids changes everything." Diego fumbled for an explanation. "She's just like a sister to me. She lost both her parents young, so I have a responsibility to look after her." "A sister? Huh? And what about your wife? Why are you keeping her hidden? By now, your wife must have had the baby, right? When's the 1-month celebration? You should treat us." Both Diego and I froze at the mention of the child, an ever-present thorn in my heart. Diego couldn't figure out how to respond, and his gaze, burning with frustration, landed on me. "Well, if he's busy, let's just go eat on our own," I said, taking the lead and throwing him a glare. As I brushed past him, I whispered through gritted teeth, "Diego, if you don't finalize our divorce soon, don't blame me for being harsh. If this goes to court, it won't look good for you." His fists clenched tightly as he grabbed his jacket and left. After the dinner, Julia was waiting for me at the entrance, holding the baby. The moment she saw me, she put on a pitiful act, her voice quivering as she spoke. "Selena, I know this is unfair to you, but this is Diego's child. Since you don't love him anymore, why don't you let him go? I really can't live without him." Then, as if on cue, she knelt down in front of me, striking a perfect pose. Her simple words made me the target of judgment. To anyone unaware of the truth, I would look like the mistress breaking up a family. My mother-in-law had already promised Julia a place in the family, wishing she could have been her daughter-in-law from the start. No matter how much Diego tried to explain that the child was just her way of coping, there was no denying that he and Julia had a child together. My colleagues all looked at me with curious and judgmental eyes, but I acted as if nothing had happened, crossing my arms and standing on the steps, looking down at Julia from above. "Julia, you shouldn't be begging me. It's Diego who's been clinging to me and refusing to divorce. You should be convincing him." Diego came out just then, hurriedly pulling Julia up from the ground. The veins on his forehead bulged. He looked furious. "Julia, I told you not to come looking for her again. Do you take my words as meaningless?" The moment he finished speaking, Diego walked up to me, lowering his voice. "Everything is my fault. Can we please do not get divorced?" Julia's eyes widened in disbelief as she screamed, on the verge of breaking down. "Diego, this is your child. Are you really going to abandon us for this woman?" I calmly shifted my gaze between Julia and Diego. The show was just getting started. "Diego, I wanted to see how you would choose." Right on cue, the baby started wailing loudly. Diego instinctively turned in the direction of the sound. At that moment, I understood. The wind carried away my tears, along with what little love I had left for Diego. Gracefully, I walked down the steps, placing the baby securely in Diego's arms. "Diego, stop struggling with them here. What right do you have to be my husband?" I casually tossed my hair back, linked arms with a close colleague, and strode off. The next day at work, no one mentioned what had happened. I deleted all of Diego's contact information, leaving only his work number and email for professional communication. He kept trying to approach me with guilt-ridden gestures, but I rejected him every time. Finally, when I handed him the lawyer's letter, he agreed to the divorce. As we walked out of the civil affairs office, Julia stood nearby with the baby in her arms, and my mother-in-law was waiting in the car. I laughed, pretending to be surprised. Getting a divorce requires bringing the whole family? Diego abruptly grabbed my hand, attempting to explain with a stiff expression. Selena, can we still be friends? His face looked forlorn, his eyes reflecting the side of my face. I sharply pulled my hand away and slapped him hard. His cheek reddened and swelled instantly. Julia handed the baby to my mother-in-law and swayed toward me, ready to strike. How dare you hit him? Her hand was halfway to me when Diego intercepted it, stopping her in her tracks. Julia, stop it. This is between Selena and me. It's my fault. I glanced at Julia, who angrily withdrew her hand, her face flushed with rage. You're right. You've wronged me. So, please, stay away from me from now on. I don't want to be entangled with irrelevant people every day. My gaze lingered between Diego and Julia before finally settling on my mother-in-law, whose face was lit up with wrinkles of joy. Out of everyone, she was probably the happiest about my divorce from Diego. After all, she had wanted Julia to be her daughter-in-law from the start, and now Julia had even given her a chubby grandson. I had become a complete outsider. A few days after the divorce, when I returned to the office, Julia began showing up at the company frequently. Everyone knew Diego had a girlfriend he was about to marry. After all, they already had a child together. All that was left was to make it official. I ignored Julia's antics, burying myself in work. As long as I could land this project, my performance for the second half of the year would be secure. Julia's repeated provocations were always met with my sharp comebacks, leaving her deflated. Eventually, she stopped focusing on me. The final signature for the project still required Diego's approval. Reluctantly, I knocked on the door to his office. His eyes lit up when he saw me, and without a word, he signed the document. As I turned to leave, he locked the door behind me, gripping my shoulders tightly with both hands. He held me in place, making it impossible for me to move. I tried to call for help, but his left hand clamped over my mouth, silencing me completely. Lowering his head to rest against my neck, he growled in a low, angry voice. Selena, you're my youth. Can't you forgive me just this once? No. The icy word hit him like a dagger, but he remained unmoved. A surge of possessiveness seemed to erupt within him, as if he wanted to imprison me forever. As I struggled, Julia knocked on the door. Smiling, I asked, Diego, are you sure you want to keep this up with your future wife right outside? Diego's expression didn't change, and his body continued to press closer to me. In that critical moment, my hand found the door handle, and with all my strength, I flung the door open. Julia stood there, caught off guard. She saw us in our compromising position, and the thermos she was holding fell to the floor with a loud clang. Instead of questioning Diego about his behavior, she turned her anger toward me. Selena, if you still like Diego, you could have told me. There was no need to tell me to my face that you don't love him anymore, only to seduce him behind my back. Before I could respond, Diego's voice cut through the tension like ice. Enough, Julia. I've told you before, I only see you as my sister. We will never get married. I'm willing to help you raise the child, but stop bringing up marriage. It's not going to happen. I've known Selena for almost 10 years. I know her character very well. You'd better stop coming to the company, Diego said loudly. The colleagues around us lowered their heads, whispering nervously among themselves. Julia silently shed tears, glared at me, and then left. Shortly after she left, a message popped up on my phone. Selena, don't get too cocky. Diego and I have a child, while you and he have nothing. Oh, I almost forgot. I've always thought you had better luck than me. But now it seems your child died early because you stole his blessings. Furious, I closed my eyes, trying to suppress my emotions. Then, I took a screenshot of the message and sent it to Diego. This is the good sister you're so proud of? Diego's face darkened, and he murmured a low, I'm sorry. He immediately called Julia, and I could faintly hear her weak attempts at an explanation, letting out a bitter laugh. I added Julia to my blacklist without hesitation. Even though Luis and I no longer had the bond of a doctor-patient relationship, he always found time to bring some joy into my life. One evening after work, he was waiting for me downstairs. Knowing about my pollen allergy, he had carefully chosen a collection of succulents and non-pollen-bearing plants to give me. Diego happened to see us and said sourly. Such worthless things. He doesn't even know what you like. I smiled faintly and asked him. Oh, so do you remember that I'm allergic to pollen? I almost forgot. You probably don't. The last time at the hospital, you nearly killed me, Diego. If you count my son, you owe me 3 lives. I turned to leave, but he grabbed my hand again, pleading desperately. Let me make it up to you for the rest of my life, okay? He tried to pull me into his arms, but Luis arrived just in time and stepped between us, pulling me behind him. Sir, you already have a new family. Please stop tormenting Selena. And who are you to her? Diego asked, frowning with a cold, disdainful tone. I silently took Luis's hand, interlacing my fingers with his and lifting them up slowly. He's my boyfriend. There was a hint of defiance in my gaze. At that moment, my heart carried a bit of spite. I wanted to see what Luis truly felt about me. Diego's eyes locked onto our entwined fingers as if he were trying to burn a hole through them. But then, as expected, Julia called him. He left hastily, not forgetting to throw a parting threat. Selena is my woman. Sooner or later, I'll make sure you back off. After Diego left, I patted Luis on the shoulder. Thanks for going along with that. I'm really sorry. As I started to pull my hand away, he gripped it tightly, not letting go. Selena, do you know I've had a crush on you for years? That day, I was planning to confess to you, but someone beat me to it. But now, I don't want to give up anymore. Will you give me a chance? Choose me, and I promise you'll never regret it. It felt like something exploded in my mind with a loud boom. I took 2 steps back, nearly losing my footing on the stairs. I won't pressure you. Take your time to think it over, Luis said gently before walking away. Left alone, I spiraled into endless self-doubt. That sentence, someone else had said it to me once, but how did it turn out? Step by step, under the guise of love, he trapped me in a house. In the end, he ended up with his so-called sister and even had a child with her. That wasn't love, it was Diego's twisted possessiveness driving him to act the way he did. I didn't give Luis an answer because, deep down, I didn't know my own. Later, I was promoted to Diego's direct superior, but he managed to cause a major scandal. The company decided to fire him, and he delusionally thought I'd help him smooth things over. Selena, please talk to the boss for me. I swear I'll change. Ask him to spare me for the sake of our history. He lowered himself completely, looking every bit like a defeated man. Naturally, I refused. When you make a mistake, you have to face the consequences. Haven't you figured that out yet? The Diego you are today is no longer the Diego I once knew. At least back then, you had some sense of reason. But now, Diego said nothing more. He packed up his things and left. Not long after, his mother somehow tracked me down. Selena, please save Diego. He doesn't want to live anymore. And no matter what I say, he won't listen. She sobbed hysterically, her tears and snot mixing together in a pitiful sight. I stepped back, puzzled, and asked, then why don't you go find Julia? Why are you coming to me? I'm divorced from him. That only made things worse. The moment I mentioned Julia's name, she erupted. Don't mention that shameless woman. She tried to pass off someone else's child as Diego's and wanted to get into our family. No way. The moment Diego lost his job, she dumped the baby on us and disappeared without a word. We haven't been able to reach her for 3 days. We only found out the truth when we took the baby to the hospital for a checkup. She's ruined us. The same woman who once affectionately called Julia her daughter now treated her as their family's greatest mistake. I didn't go to Diego's house alone. I brought Luis with me. If he wanted to be part of my future, he needed to understand the past I had endured. When we arrived, Diego had already been rushed to the hospital for emergency treatment. Thankfully, the wounds weren't deep, and his life was saved. When he woke up, the first person he saw was me. Naturally, he assumed I'd had a change of heart. Selena, I knew you still cared for me. Look at me now. Have I disappointed you? I nodded, then shook my head. Diego, you make me feel nothing but contempt. He froze for a moment, as if trying to decipher my emotions. Calmly, I continued. I know everything. Julia cheated on you and left the child behind. How can you be so stupid? Like a complete fool? Honestly, I can't figure out why I ever liked you in the first place. If there had been any lingering sadness in my heart before, Diego's repeated favoritism toward Julia had worn my patience down to nothing. I looked at Diego lying on the hospital bed, finding the scene both tragic and strangely satisfying. I had spent 10 months carrying a child, sacrificing my youth, only to realize I had fallen for the wrong person. And now, It seemed he was finally paying the price for his mistakes. Tears filled Diego's eyes as he spoke with a choked voice. Selena, I've lost everything. All I have left is you. I cut him off and pulled out the divorce certificate from my pocket, its bold print gleaming in the light. See this? I carry it with me every day as a reminder of how terribly wrong I was back then. Let me make it crystal clear for you today. Do you think there's any chance for us to fix things when 3 lives lied between us? His gaze flickered with uncertainty, and I swung a punch at his face, feeling immensely satisfied. Dream on, scumbag! I stormed out, leaving behind his panicked mother stomping her feet and Diego lying on the bed like a lifeless heap. As I stepped out of the hospital room, the bright sunshine greeted me. Luis didn't bring up the idea of us being together again. Instead, he said, "As long as you're happy, I'm happy. Whenever you decide you want a home, I'll always be here waiting for you." I smiled at him, then turned to glance at a swing in the distance. On it sat a little boy, waving at me before gradually fading away. I realized it must have been my child, bidding me a final goodbye, and I knew it was time for me to say goodbye to my past as well. The taxi I had called was already waiting. I quickly grabbed Luis's hand and opened the door. He smiled faintly, and I returned his smile. If only time could freeze here, just like this.